So my name's Andy Joss. I look after the data governance business for Informatica, covering Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And today, I wanted to take you through what we call the market perspectives around data governance. And that's really what's happening in the world of data governance, how the change in the world of the need of data is driving organizations to think differently about what data governance is, why they should do it, and some of the ideas that are coming to market that really help accelerate both the value and adoption of data governance for many organizations. There we go, technology's working today. So I wanted to start with part of the challenge. So we talk about the world of data 3.0, which is where data sits at the heart of the business. We're seeing a number of key factors that are influencing most organizations. So the amount of data that organizations have to cope with now is increasing and it's becoming ever more challenging. We have regulations such as KVKK and GDPR, which is bringing in new consumers and new users of data. In many of those cases around privacy, there'd be privacy professionals or maybe legal people. We have new types of data because of the necessary connected world that we live in. We have new technologies such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, either replacing or augmenting many of the functions that happen in organizations. And also in many places, data that now sits in the cloud, whether it be a local cloud or whether it be public clouds, based on the type of services available in different territories and in different countries. This is creating problems for many organizations, just coping with all of this complexity. On top of that, we have a growing amount of regulation. So many of you will be from regulated industries, in which case you'll have regulation which is specific to your industry. But in many territories, privacy, whether it be something that you have to do with locally, or maybe something that you have to cope with globally or in your external markets, is becoming a very, very challenging topic. So as you're probably very aware, we had GDPR go live in Europe back in last year. So we're just over a year into that. We've seen a massive uptake in organizations looking at technology and how they automate many of the GDPR processes that to get compliant they did manually, but now they realize that actually that's just not a scalable solution. So the idea that we're having to cope with regulation, regardless as to what industry we're coming from, again, is posing a great deal of challenge. And then on top of that, in many industries, the expectations that customers have of us, of what we do, of the services that we offer, those are changing. And there's just a few statistics I just wanted to point out to you. Let's see if that works. There we go. So many organizations, you'll seen in the press, organizations get hacked or there's a data breach. In most cases, the consumers and the customers of that company, they blame the company for the data breach, not the people who actually committed the breach itself. So reputations are being damaged by the fact that the breach has happened. In the US, for example, over 80% of consumers will stop trading or working with an organization if they don't feel that they can trust them with their data in event of things like a breach or a hack. Significant numbers. What that says is that things like privacy have gone up in the agenda of pretty much every organization I talk to. As I say, I cover Europe, Middle East, Africa, Latin America. In some countries and some territories, it's a bit more of a developed conversation. So in Western Europe, we have GDPR, which is live. We have KVKK here, we have POPI in South Africa, we have LGPD in Brazil. It's a topic which is coming up an awful lot, and organizations are starting to recognize that actually if you do things like data privacy well, it can be a business benefit and a business advantage, not just a regulatory burden. We're going to come back to that idea in a second. But what I wanted to really focus on today was what has changed in the world of data governance. So I think back 5 years, most of my customers were in regulated industries and they were probably in financial services. And they were very focused on the left-hand side, which was around managing risk and around managing regulation and compliance. Very finite scope, very specific functions in an organization. Over the last 5 years, cost control has come in, but actually today, most organizations I'm talking to about data governance are looking at doing data governance because of what's on the right-hand side. This idea that it can and should drive business value. not just about supporting the other activities as well. That's a massive change. So some of the challenges that we talked about, the market expectations, are driving change in organizations, the way they think about data, and how they're going to manage that data, and particularly how they're going to manage, govern that data going forward. Don't just take my word for it. You can see there's numbers of articles, and there's press and etc. other activities. Thank you. Well, as you can see, it's not just us that thinks this. We're also seeing organizations such as IDC, Forbes, are saying that actually data governance is now strategically important, not just for compliance, but for driving value in businesses. Let's just think for a second about where we were. And I think back maybe 5 years, which is not a long in the whole story of data governance. The scope of what we were doing and how we were viewing it was quite narrow. It tended to be focused on what we would call risk-based activities, typically around regulation and compliance. The number of people involved, the amount of data involved, the amount of systems, the amount of complexity was relatively narrow, well understood, and well defined. Our world has dramatically changed. It no longer looks like that. We still have that, but what's changed is the fact that now data has become so important that organizations are starting to recognize that data is something for everybody in an organization, and it needs to be managed and governed by everybody in an organization. So the scope now is huge, and you can see some of the usual departments in terms of risk and compliance, IT, but also all the business functions. Okay, so why is the business interested in data governance? Well, actually, if you think about what many businesses are doing, they're looking at things like advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning, as a way of trying to better understand their customers, maybe their buying or their spending or their service patterns, and how to engage them and drive a better, more positive customer experience. You can use a lot of technology to help do that, but actually you need good data to do that too. And a very simple example, I was with an insurance company recently. They're using a machine learning platform to help them better understand the needs of their clients. What they did is they built some models, they started to deploy the models. What they recognized quite quickly is the value, the outcomes they were expecting just weren't being achieved. And to start with, they couldn't work out why. With a bit of careful help from the data department and the governance department, they realized that the data that they were using to build and train those models was really poor. So the models were functioning poorly, giving them poor outcomes, poor results. So data is really important, particularly in the world of the business. The challenge we've got is knowledge about data sits everywhere in organizations. It sits in pieces of paper, it sits in electronic documents, it sits in people's heads, and in some cases it's things that people just think they know. So we have data all over the place. And the challenge that we have is to make data work for us at an enterprise level to cope with all of these challenges and to recognize how to take advantage of the opportunity. We need to try and harness all of that, or at least as much as we can. And that's what we call intelligent data governance. It's 2019. No product would be anything unless it had the word intelligent in front of it, or intelligent, or AI in the middle. I'll come back to that in a second. But actually, for me, there's some key points that sit on this slide that I think is probably really important. Over here on the left-hand side, it talks about business relevance. The key here is business. I was with a fashion retailer earlier this week, and I was sat with their IT department, and they were talking to me about their first phase of a governance project that hadn't gone well. And they were talking to me about what they wanted to do in their second phase. And their answer was to buy better tools. I had to stop them and say, guys, I'm sorry, but actually, can you explain to me why, as a business, you want to do data governance and what value it brings to your business? They couldn't answer that question. And the reason being is that they saw it as a finite project in IT. It's not. Data governance is what we call an enterprise-wide team game. It's about collaboration between business and IT. And if you take away nothing from today other than the words of collaboration between business and IT, that would be great. Because when you get business and IT collaborating around data, the value of data governance shoots up, and it becomes very relevant for organizations. And I'll give you some examples of organizations a little bit later. And that's going to be the second part of the presentation today, is to talk about some techniques that we use to help get the business to engage. But also we want to be able to measure and monitor what happens in the world of data governance. Really, really important. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. It's a very old expression. In the world of data governance, that is absolutely true. So how do we start to bring that into play? It's the governance teams that are responsible for that. And I'm going to talk to you about a shift in how I'm seeing some governance teams work that's helping them drive adoption into the business and getting more measurement around the data that the business is using. And last but not least, of course, we have the IT and the data management teams, the people who have to do a lot of the heavy lifting today. And the reason I say today is many organizations I go to, the business, one of the first things they ask for is self-service. We want to do this ourselves. Why? Most IT and data departments don't have enough people. They don't have all the skills that are needed. Think about the complexity that we talked about earlier. And don't have the time. Therefore, the business can't wait, so the business want to do it themselves. So the data management teams, their role is changing to support self-service architectures and self-service technologies to enable the business to react in the time and in the way that they want. That means there's a lot of things that the data management team does and can do. More importantly, will do differently to support self-service. And again, I'll give you some examples of those sorts of things shortly. So in the world of governance, what's one of the key changes that we've seen really in the last 3, maybe 4 years? And we call this data context. So think back to the example of the COO, his dashboard, and his employee figures, the number of full-time employees he's got. Data context would tell him how old that data was. It would tell him where that data came from. It would tell him who had been involved in that data. It would tell him everything that happened to that data, and many other things as well. So data context is a really powerful weapon when given to the business, because it means that they can now make better decisions on the data that they're self-serving. And data context is kind of what we call the new battleground in data governance. It's getting organizations to recognize data context is just as important as the data itself. But there are 4 aspects to data context. The first is what we call technical understanding. You will have a technical landscape of places where you hold data. You'll have databases and file stores and Hadoop systems, Hive and all these other kind of places. Plus, of course, you've got Excel spreadsheets, PDF files, Word documents, all of this kind of environment. There's a technical landscape. So actually you need to understand your technical landscapes. That's kind of the first thing we need. The second then part is then what we call business relevance. Why? The business looks at things quite differently from the way IT looks at things. The business thinks in terms of projects, thinks in terms of processes, thinks in terms of regulation, jurisdiction, territory. They have a different way of looking at things, a different way of thinking about things, which is just as important, and it's also part of data context. But it doesn't stop there. We also need to think about operational practices, how the data is actually being managed and used. Let me give you an example of that. I had one of my customers that had a team of people who were doing what's called a data privacy impact assessment. It's a GDPR requirement on a particular system to assess what personal data was on that system and how it was being used. 3 weeks they were working on that system. The key thing, if somebody had asked about the operational practices on that system, they wouldn't have done any work. Why? Because the system wasn't used. It was running, but no one was using it. So they wasted a lot of time. So a simple example of operational practices and how it relates to governance helps us, again, build data context. And the last part is, and this is what we talk about a lot when we talk about privacy, is usage and access. Who has access to what data, for what purpose, and why? And there's ways that we can harvest all of this information, because in many organizations, a lot of this information already exists. It's about how we harness it, and that's another big change in the world of what we call intelligent data governance. So this idea that the understanding already exists is really important. Because if it already exists, our job now is to go and find it and harvest it. Get access to it, put it in one place, make sense of it, make it available to people. And that's a lot about the technology that we deploy is about doing exactly that. But one of the most important things is not just what have we got, but the relationship between other things that we also have. So understanding the linkage between data, its meaning, how it flows around the organization, is equally, if not more, important than understanding of the data itself. In most organizations, you either know this, or we can discover it. So discovery of information has become a big topic in the world of data governance. Why? Because it's using technology to give us insights that we wouldn't have otherwise. What do I mean by that? So let's take an example for one of my banks, one of my customers. They had a GDPR program. One of the key things they wanted to know was, where is all of the personal data that we use? And they embarked on that program by having people sit down and look at systems and manually scanning applications. Whilst they were in the middle of that project, the marketing department came along and went, I'll grab all of the customer data and I'll pull it over to this Hadoop system and I'm going to do some new fancy analytics on it. That's great for marketing. From a privacy viewpoint, you've upped the risk because now you have a new store of data and nobody knew. So discovery technologies is about helping understand what data you have and where it comes from, but discovery also understands linkage and connection between these things too. So we talked about this idea of data context. 5 years ago, we were asking people in the business to do this for us. What does this mean? Where should I go to get something? How do I understand what this is? What happens to it? We used to ask people to do that. No wonder the business never wanted to do data governance, because what's the value to them in doing that? So we use artificial intelligence to help us understand and automate the collection and management of this thing we call data context. The technology, we call it Claire. That's the thing in the middle. Just think of that as an AI, machine learning platform that brings intelligence to a lot of what we do. So how do we use this technology? So the first is to go and get access to that technical understanding of your data landscape. So we use discovery type technology to go and look at all the different systems that hold data, and we go and work out what data you have in those systems. But it doesn't stop there. We then to put that in a place where somebody can get access to it, so they can go and search it and look at it. So discovery of technical information has become really important. Why? Because organizations grow and change on a constant basis. So if we can't do that, it's hard for us to govern our data, let alone take advantage of it. So another part of this is automating business understanding. So what do I mean by that? So many organizations, you'll have policies, you'll have regulations, project definitions, business process diagrams, regulatory requirements, legal entity definitions. They just tend to sit in different file stores, in different document types. Actually, part of what we're saying is let's go and find that information and let's bring it all together, but with the technical information. Let's link those two worlds together. A fundamental change in what we've been doing. We also want to discover operational information, and we want to discover usage and access information. So we use technology to discover as much of this as possible and bring it together. So part of what the AI does is it helps that bringing together. It helps us bring meaning and understanding to something that we wouldn't mean or understand otherwise. Let me give you an example of that. One of my customers is the Bank of Ireland over in Western Europe. They're looking at these type of technologies. Why? Their number one problem in their business is finding information that the business wants to use. A across a very large and complex landscape. Sounds like a complex problem. The problem they have is that the naming conventions for systems, for tables, for columns, for rows, makes no sense to people in the business. So we use AI to automatically tag discovered data. So when the business goes and looks for it, they just look for things that they know and understand, such as customer, product, service. And if it's called something completely different in a physical system, that doesn't matter. The technology takes care of that for them. So it's really important how we use information, and we use technology such as AI to help bring meaning and understanding to our data landscape, and particularly how then we govern it. One of the start points, or probably one of the most common start points for many organizations, I've had this conversation with many data privacy officers. Simple question is, do you know where all of your data is? It never used to be a big problem until data privacy came along. So in Europe, for example, we have this thing called a subject access request. That's a request where me as an individual, I can go to, for example, my bank and say, show me all the information you have about me as an individual. They have to then look and go, right, all the different places that data could be around Andy, where is all this data? How do I find it to respond to that? Because they have a maximum of 30 days to respond to it. So having technology that can look in all different systems and say, I can find names, I can find addresses, dates of birth, postcodes, ethnicity, and everything else that we need to know is really, really important. This is the discovery technology that we talked about. This is how we use AI to help bring meaning and understanding. And actually, we bring it together in something we call a data catalog. The reason that becomes significant is I've done all this hard work of discovering all this information. It's only valuable to the business when they can use it and they can search it and find the things that they want. And that's what the catalog does. It enables that searching and the finding of things. So there's lots of different types of systems we have to scan to find all this information. But that's great. We use the technology to do that. So if we take that as maybe a start point for how many organizations are thinking of governance, I just wanted to change tack slightly and just think about some of the enablers that I think help get the business to engage in the world of governance. Because these are the things that actually make a big difference as to whether governance is going to be a success or not. And I think it is quite blunt and it is quite simple. And I'll touch on each one of these as we go along. So the first one I'm going to talk about is what we call domain and lineage discovery. What do I mean by domain? Well, domain are pieces of information that I'm interested in. So let's take a privacy example. I'm interested in information about people. That would be name, address, date of birth, postcode, telephone number, email address, etc., etc., etc. Each one of those is what we call a domain. We use that to go and discover where that information is across your enterprise. We do that so you don't have to. But we don't just discover that data, we discover what happens to that data, how data moves around a business. Data comes into a business at some point, it goes through lots of different systems probably, and then it gets used and consumed by the business. Understanding what happened across the life cycle of that data is really important from a privacy viewpoint, because you can understand who's using it, you can understand what's happening to it, and you can understand how you can put some control around it. So we automate the discovery of both of those. We use technology to discover that. Lineage is really, really important. It's always been important from a standard regulatory viewpoint, but from a privacy viewpoint, if you are a data privacy officer or a chief privacy officer, you want to understand what happened to all of the personal data in your business. Who did what to the data? When did they do it? How did they do it? Was it done properly? And did we have the right policies and controls in place? Really important. Let me give an example of that. Bank of Ireland again. They decided that they wanted to have a representation of their data from a privacy viewpoint for the Information Commissioner in Dublin. The Information Commissioner came in, had a look, and they could explain the relationships between all the different pieces of data, what they were, how they were accessed, how they were used, who was using them. They could explain that to the regulator. That's a powerful position to be in because it shows you have an understanding of what's happening to your data. In this particular case, it's related to privacy. But actually, the point at the bottom is really quite important because the business view of data is very often different from the technical view, which is fine, but we have to connect those two worlds because they are connected. And again, we use technology to do that, to make the connection between those two worlds. This is another area of a great deal of talk, which is in the world of data governance. What's one of the biggest advantages that we have? Remember, I talked about much of this information is already available. Much of it's available in the form of metadata, data about data. So you think, for example, of an Excel spreadsheet. You can do almost anything you like in an Excel spreadsheet. It's not very hard to work out. It's not very easy, sorry, to work out kind of the details of what went on. But you can work out when it was created, who updated it, when it was updated. There's a whole series of things that you can work out. So pretty much everything in the world of data has some associated metadata. The biggest challenge we've had in the last 5 years is we've ignored the metadata. We've focused completely on the data and forgotten the metadata. Yet the metadata tells us a huge amount of what's happening to our data. So all we're saying is, let's harvest it, let's use it, because this has helped bring data context. So a lot of what you're going to hear about is about how you use metadata to bring meaning and understanding to help the business take the most value out of data. Bit of a technical conversation, but let me kind of change what I mean by that. So we call this intelligent glossary association. The business has ways of describing data. We're not going to change that. We shouldn't try and change that, because actually that's the way the business works. But we need to understand if they say premium, as in the example I gave you earlier, for this business unit it means before tax, and for this business unit it means after tax. They use the same term to mean different things. Organizations may use different terms to mean the same thing, both of which are okay. We have to cope with all of that. So what these things actually mean, and more importantly, how they're connected to the data that supports the business, is really important. So we use technology to try and work out if this is what the business is talking about, and these are my physical data assets, are these two connected? So we use AI, machine learning, to help bring meaning and understanding to that. So it's a really important, we're not getting rid of the governance department, we're just asking them to do different things and make them more efficient. So we use this artificial intelligence technology to go make the connections between what the business talks about and the physical data that it would be connected to. Why? Because when the business wants data, they want to understand it in terms and in references that make sense to them, which is exactly what we're doing with this idea. And we've talked a lot about getting access to information. What's one of the key reasons why businesses would want to use information? Well, actually, they want to search and find things so they can go and do what it is they need to do. So what's the first thing that you would ever do if you wanted to know something? You probably get your phone or you get your tablet out, and then you go and do a search on a well-known search engine of your choice. We're just saying, no, do the same thing, but do it for your data in your business. Let people write a query in a way that makes sense to them, like we do with Google and Bing and lots of other search engines, but just it's on your data. So we call this a graph search. Graph searches help me find things really quickly. More importantly, it helps me understand how things are connected to that. Let me give an example. If I'm looking for customer information, I can go and retrieve everything which is described as customer. What I also want to know is which business processes act on customer data, which systems support customer data, which policies would govern customer data, which privacy regulations are impacting on that data. So this idea of searching isn't just about finding the thing I'm looking for, It's about finding the connections and the relationships to everything that sits around it, because that's how I start to get data context that we were talking about earlier. This is a really powerful idea because you can use it in two ways. You can use it in the traditional search engine way, where I sit and I make a search. I have a particular question I want to ask. I'll go and write a query in whatever language I need, and magically I get some answers. That's one way of doing it. But a different way of doing it is saying, actually, very often in many parts of an organization, I'm asking the same questions, but I'm maybe asking them at different times, every week, every month, every quarter, every year. So all I'm suggesting is that we take this idea of a query and we store it and save it, because now we can just run it whenever we need. If I want, I can take the output from it and I can put it into a dashboard to make it simple for people to understand. So when we talk about automating data context, there's different ways that we can use this information to extract value, to help the business really gain understanding of what it is so they can drive value themselves. And we call this to connect the dots. The dots are all the different pieces of information scattered around your enterprise, the different people who are involved in it, the different policies and processes that connect it, and how that all comes together. We call that connecting the dots. One of my favorite subjects is around data quality automation. I've been into so many meetings, and I'll say to people, how good's your data? I get typically one of two answers. Our data's poor, or our data's great. I'm sorry, but neither of those answers is a good answer. What does good mean? What does bad mean? It's a subjective term. So actually getting people thinking about the measurement of the quality of data and what we mean by data quality is really important. And then once we've done that, it's about, well, what do we do to fix the problem? Because there's no point in knowing that we have bad data if we do nothing about it. So why is that a challenge? Well, actually, the people who understand about the quality of data typically are sitting in the business. And what we used to do is we used to give them some technical tools and some technical people and say, write some technical rules for the business. And they're going to go, but I don't understand how to do this. I'm not a technology person, I'm a business person. I can describe it to you, but I can't codify it. It's not my job, it's not my skill set, which is absolutely true. And then the problem would be, if I do that, and I can build a rule, I probably have to deploy it in 10, 20, 50, 100 different places. And then what happens when I change the rule? I then have to go and change it in 10, 20, 50, 100 places. Just too hard. Just too hard. So one of the fundamental changes that we had to bring in fact, there were two fundamental changes. The first is, who is the best person to define a quality rule? That's the business. What was stopping them from doing it? We made them do it using technical tools. So we said, let's stop doing that. Let them write a rule in a way that makes sense to them, and we'll use technology to convert that to a technical rule that we can then deploy in the business. It makes it easier for the business to engage now because we're letting them do things in a way that makes sense for them. But the second change we wanted to make was, if I have a rule, and it might be around date of birth, any kind of dates is a really good example of this. If you're doing any checking around dates or validity of information, the chances are that rule should be run in lots of different places. And in most organizations, it's not. It tends to get run at the very end, which is why we get so many problems with data. Why do we not do that before? Because it's too hard to deploy this across an enterprise. So we said we have to stop doing that. So let the business define it in the way that they want, and we use technology to create the technical rules. And now we say to the business, where do you want to deploy it? So remember we talked about where data sits, what it means. The business can now say it's in those 20 different systems over there. And we press a button and we deploy it to 20 different systems automatically for them. Now what we've got is a really powerful environment where we can embed quality into the business really quickly, really effectively. More importantly, we can now start to measure quality at different points in the information lifecycle. Really, really important change to bring up the quality of information. So part of this is about discovering and doing the profiling, as we'd call it, of data. The second part then comes, well, what do you do about it? So the way that we show this to people, it used to be on dashboards that said, here's the quality of information at a point in time, at a point in the process. That's changed. That makes no sense, because we need to know what happened before that point in time, and we need to know what happened after that point in time as well. So now when we take business understanding, technical understanding, and we bring the two together, because we can deploy data quality across all of our landscape, I can now understand data quality at every step in a business process. I can understand data quality every step on a system or technical lineage. And I can see how data quality changes as it moves around my enterprise. One of the financial services regulators in London for the banking industry, there's a well-known banking regulation called BCBS 239, some of you will know that. They've started to mandate that when organizations talk to them about their risk data, they want to understand the quality of that data at every step in its life cycle, which is both from a business process viewpoint and from a technical viewpoint. You can now do that, and we use technology to automate most of that. Why is this also important for the business? We're giving them information they didn't have before. We're actually not asking them to do very much. We're asking them to do things in a way that makes sense to them, and we're automating a lot of the technology, so it's happening quicker. They're getting the insights they need faster and for less effort. So now data governance is seen as less of a burden and more of an opportunity. And it's some of these capabilities that's starting to change the minds of people in the business about data governance. Big, big topic, pretty much everywhere I go. It's what we call operationalizing data privacy. You think about some of the things we've talked about. We'll have personal data scattered throughout an enterprise. And we use technology to go and discover where all of this information is and what it means. And then we use technology to link it to the way the business uses that data. It gives us a great understanding of how data is being used. But actually, understanding is one thing. Controlling that data is something else. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think for a second that maybe you have some personal data and arrives in a data warehouse, how do the people who use that data warehouse know what they can do with that data, whether they should even be allowed to use it or not? In many cases, because of the way warehouses are structured, there's no way of people knowing. But actually, from a privacy viewpoint, you have to put control around that. So when we talk about operationalizing things like data privacy and taking the landscape that we've just talked about, we want to understand what data we've got. Let's say it's email address, which is classed as personal data under GDPR. We understand how it moves around an organization, who has access to it, and maybe it ends up in a data warehouse. What I want to be able to do is to say, if this has some consent to be used, let the people who use the data warehouse see the information. If they don't have consent to use it, hide it, or what we call mask it. So we can take all this insight and we can push it down into things like masking technologies as a way of helping protect and actually operationalizing a lot of the concepts that we have coming through in privacy. Another idea around operationalizing data privacy is now I have a series of policies that says this is how long I can keep data. So in the UK, for example, we have tax legislation that says that organizations need to keep data for approximately 7 years after the transaction completed. What do organizations do once the 7 years is up? In many cases, they probably don't get rid of it. But in the reality, being in the world of privacy, keeping data that we shouldn't have is probably a risk. So we should get rid of it. Or if we don't really want to get rid of it, we think we might need it, we need to put it somewhere where it's really secure, where limited people can get access to it, but only for a specific purpose. So technology such as archiving technology are now being deployed to help get rid of data that we shouldn't have and putting it into places where only certain peoples with certain sets of criteria have access to it. One of our largest clients in the UK is one of the large banks. they use this to help, not just from a privacy viewpoint, but help retire applications. Many, many organizations bring in new systems to replace an old one, but kind of keep the old one running because we don't quite know what happens when we turn it off. Okay, well, archiving technology has multiple purposes to help organizations turn those systems off and get the benefits that they probably had originally. And then we talked about this idea of business adoption. We have this simple concept called an overlay. It's a really, really simple but very powerful concept. So when we talk about data context, very often I want to understand a combination of things at the same time. It's a little difficult to see here, my apologies. This is actually what we call a system lineage diagram. It's how physically data moves around an organization. You'll probably just about be able to make out there's some things that are green and some things that are red. I have two things I'm looking at here. I'm looking at how information flows around the system, and the green and the red is actually the quality scores for data at certain points in its life cycle, overlaid onto the movement of that data. So why is this really important? I went to Latin America. I talked to the lady that was responsible for, in the central bank, was responsible for giving the board of the bank the right data to set monetary policy for the entire country. And this is a large economy. She genuinely was kept awake at night by understanding, am I giving them the right information? Because if I give them the wrong information, what are the policy decisions they're going to make? And are they going to be correct for the people and the economy of that country? What this gives people in that, and whether it be people who are doing monetary policy or people who just have problems with reports, one of the most common questions I get is, there's a problem with this report, what do I do? The fact that I can take lots of information and I can overlay one piece of information on top of another, it gives me a lot more insight, it gives me a lot more context. So I can now start to use data governance as a diagnostic tool to help me understand what's going on in my business, and particularly when things are going wrong. Hugely powerful for the business because they can do this in a self-service manner, and it helps them spot and identify things really quickly. And sometimes it's about understanding the basics. You won't be able to see this, but right in the middle of that, there's a little box. On that box is an Excel spreadsheet. Very quickly, as a business user, I can see when I look at that Excel spreadsheet, there are no data quality rules. There are no data definitions. There's no data owner. There are no policies. It's connected to no processes. I know nothing about the Excel spreadsheet. If this is an important report and I have an Excel spreadsheet in the middle of my flow of data and I know nothing about that spreadsheet, what's happening? I don't know. Now I can start to use the technology in the diagnostic mode to help me bring understanding. Really important to help get businesses to adopt. And this is where the role of the governance department is starting to change. It used to be that we defined policies and we told people, well, this is what you will do. This is how you will work. That's difficult because at that point the business is going, what's in it for me? Why would I do that? And in many cases they just said, well, I'm not doing that. Well, let's change some of the thinking. One of our customers, UK Bank, the way that they help change that thinking is to take an existing idea and just use it differently. So when we have a problem with our laptop or our phone, what do we do as a business? We pick up the phone and we send a message to the help desk. We raise a ticket and hopefully the problem gets solved. Let's take that same idea and apply that to data, which is what this bank has done. So now when people in the business have a problem with data, they call the same number as if they have a problem with a laptop. And they say, I have a problem with my data. The help desk team, they record the problem, but there's a little tick box that says data governance. So when the call's accepted, that request goes to the governance team, not to the regular support team. So the idea of what I call a data ticket, a really powerful way of saying to the business, if you have a problem, if something doesn't look right, if something's missing, how do you do something about it? Raise a ticket. What's the biggest challenge that we have when we raise a ticket, when we call the help desk and say there's a problem with my laptop? Something's happening, but I don't know what. I don't know where we are in the process, who's involved in it. I don't know what's happening. What are the biggest frustrations that people have? So we have this idea of workflow to help the business collaborate. It helps understand, if this is missing, this is what I do. If this is wrong, this is what I do. If this needs fixing, here are the people I need to go to. So we have processes defined to do that. And we show people the process. We show them where the process is at the step that it's at that point in time. And if there are people collaborating around that step, we show them that too. And it's all done in a managed and automated environment in terms of audit too, so people can see actually what's happening. So why is that important? Well, from a self-service viewpoint, if I raise a ticket, if it's urgent to me, I want to see that it's being worked on quickly. If in the world of GDPR, I have 30 days to respond to something or 72 hours in the data breach, time is really important. So if the ticket isn't progressing fast enough, I want to do something about it. But I need to know that it's not progressing fast enough. So this idea of workflow collaboration is about getting the business to engage. It's about getting the governance team to help support that. But it's also about creating transparency and visibility. Really important in terms of business adoption, because without this, the business doesn't really understand if something's not right, how do I get it fixed? Question I always get, who do we go to? Now we have an answer for them, and it's done in a fully automated and fully audited way. And then on top of all of that, we think about most organizations, change is the only constant we have. We're buying businesses, we're getting rid of businesses, we're getting new data, we're getting rid of data, we're adding systems, changing systems. Change is going on all the time. So if I want to make a change, what's the impact of that change? In many cases, that's a very, very large piece of work. And at the end of it, we're still crossing our fingers and hoping that the analysis means we don't break things, because we live in a very integrated world. Impact assessment is about understanding, if I change something, what's impacted? So remember, right back at the beginning, we talked about what data we have and where it is, and how it's connected and moves around an organization. If I want to change a date of birth field, for example, what's it connected to? What's going to be impacted by that one single change? I really want to know that before I make the change, because then I stand more chance of it working and not breaking potentially quite a lot of things. So impact assessment is about using all of this insight so that when you're going through change, you stand a really good chance of understanding the impact of the change before you break something. We had a very famous example of a bank in the UK that went through a change cycle very publicly. They rolled out some new services and a migration, and the services and systems went down really quickly, and they were offline for days, made the national newspapers and the national press. That organization has been trying to recover their reputation ever since. So understanding change and an impacted change is really important, and the business really appreciate that, because they can now ask the question, what if I change this? What if I add that? What if I delete this? They can see that before they do it. It's about helping the business, again, get value from it. So I wanted to take you through some of the key changes we've seen, and all of those changes are A, to help get the business to engage, is to help them get more value from their data, whether it be to give them data quicker, give them more understanding of the data, assessments of quality, what's happening to it, who's using it. But actually, most importantly, it's about engagement. Data governance work when we get the business engaged. If we can give them tools that help them do their job better, that help them relate to data better, to take advantage of data better, they will want to do this. And when they want to do it, that's when we know we're winning. That's how we're seeing change, when the business is saying, yes, we actually want to do this. So I've given you some examples of some practical things that organizations are doing to actually make that change physical. But one of the things I've talked about is we've talked about technology. There's a lot of technology potentially involved in this. So actually, how do you make the technology work? Well, one of the things that we recognize is it's great having the best technology in the world, but if you don't explain to people in a self-service way how it works, how you should use it, what it's really designed for, what its strengths really are, if we don't tell people that in a way that's convenient to them, actually that's not a lot of help. So we spent a lot of time on things like the knowledge community, something we call a how-to library. So for all of the things we've talked about today, you can go and see videos of what it does. You can see videos and tutorials as to how this should work or how you could take advantage of these things. The idea being is that you can self-serve this information to make yourselves as successful as possible for your governance project and program in whichever shape and form it looks like for you. And the last part in all of that is this idea of a discussion board. Because data governance is so important in so many businesses, in so many countries, there are lots and lots of people trying to do the same things that you're probably trying to do. Some of them will be behind you compared to what you're doing. Some will be ahead. So the knowledge community and the boards is about enabling you to ask questions of the community and see what other people are doing. How are they tackling these problems? What sort of solutions are they finding that help drive value for them? Again, it's about providing that self-service model and getting the best value out of the data. So remember, we talked about this idea of making data governance intelligent. Hopefully you got a sense from some of the things that we're doing that we're trying to really accelerate the value of governance to the business. That's one of our primary drivers. And remember, right back at the beginning, we talked about business relevance. Everything we do is about trying to provide business relevance, because when we give business relevance, that's when we get engagement. When we get engagement, that's when we know that governance is working. As you can see, there's more to it than that, but clearly we don't have time for all of that today. I hope you found that useful. I'm going to be around for a short while. Unfortunately, I have a flight to catch fairly soon. If you do have any questions, please feel free to come and ask during the coffee break. In the meantime, thank you very much. And I think coffee will be 15 minutes, I think. So if you'd like to come and join us for coffee, that'd be great. Thank you very much.